Hello, I'm Sara Amundson. I run the Make a Monster project. I'm a horror writer. You request monsters and I write short stories about them. Today I am going to read a story about a tooth fairy monster. If you stick around when I'm done, I will tell you about the inspiration for this story, which is something fucked up I did when I was a kid. But let's get started with the monsters. Melissa was super excited when her first tooth finally fell out. Well, fell wasn't a very good word for it. Yanked was more like it. It had been wobbling for weeks. She compulsively poked it with the tip of her tongue until it was connected by only a thin thread of meat. Her brothers teased her, calling her a big baby and a scaredy cat for not getting a good grip on it and ripping it out herself. Melissa thought that sounded disgusting and awful. But when her dad offered to achieve the same thing by tying one end of a piece of string around the tooth and the other around a doorknob, the prospect instantly became more palatable. The tooth had flown free with a twinge of pain and a tang of blood. Melissa was amazed when her dad dropped the little bicuspid onto her palm. It seemed so much bigger when she was only able to see it with her tongue. It had felt like a tiny mountain range, but it was actually just a nub. A nub worth money. "What will the tooth fairy bring me, Daddy?" she said, hopping up and down with excitement. "Sophia said she got $10 for her tooth, and hers had a cavity in it. Do you think I'll get that much? Mine doesn't have a cavity. Maybe mine is worth even more. Maybe I'll get $20. The thought of such an astronomical sum of money made her jump about with even more enthusiasm. She wondered if she should try that door trick with some of her other teeth. Her father laughed and gave her a hug. "We'll see, kiddo. I'm no tooth fairy expert, but that seems kind of pricey. Maybe the tooth fairy was drunk when she visited Sophia. I've heard that tooth fairies are total booze hounds." Melissa's mom stopped folding laundry long enough to playfully snap a towel at her husband's rear end. "Max!" she scolded. When it was time for bed, Melissa placed her tooth in a small, round wooden container. It had a smiling cartoon molar painted on its lid. The image was faded and worn from being used by 3 generations of children in her mom's family. Melissa had watched with jealousy as her older brothers got to use the tooth box. Finally, it was her turn, the first of many lucrative tooth money exchanges in her future. She tucked the little box under her pillow and closed her eyes. Sleep swallowed her up quickly, despite her excitement. A few hours later, she was pulled out of her dreams by a strange clicking sound. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, which grew wide with surprise when she saw the creature at the foot of her bed. Her superwoman nightlight cast an eerie glow around its shifting form. It was a dense cloud of constantly moving teeth, with 2 deep black cavities for eyes. The teeth chittered as they crawled over one another in an endless, frenetic dance. They held together tightly enough to form the shape of an enormous molar. The mass of teeth lifted into the air like a swarm of flies, moving to hover over her bed. Melissa had imagined the tooth fairy as a tiny, pretty lady with wings. This wasn't at all what she'd expected. Nevertheless, she was thrilled. None of her friends had ever seen the tooth fairy before. She'd be the most popular girl in class. This was way cooler than getting $10. As soon as she thought about money, she dug under her pillow for the little wooden box. She pulled it out, a small part of her momentarily noting the difference between the smiling cartoon molar painted on its top and the rotten black cavities of the chattering teeth cloud's eyes. She pulled the lid off the little container and lifted it to show the tooth fairy. The tooth in the box shivered for a moment and then zipped into the air, becoming one with the rattling mass that floated above her. Melissa frowned. cocking her head to the side. "Do I get money?" she asked. The clicking of the teeth grew louder, almost agitated, a sound that made her ears itch. No, it wasn't just her ears. Her mouth itched too. She pressed her hand to her lips. Her gums were filled with a strange, buzzing feeling. This was all so odd. She began to wonder if it was just a dream. A sharp pain in her jaw assured her she was wide awake. One of her teeth wrested itself free from its home in her head and flew to join the cloud floating over her. Melissa didn't even have a chance to yelp before all of her teeth were tearing loose and flinging themselves at the creature that had begun to descend toward her. The pain was so intense that she blacked out just as the chattering swarm settled over her face. When her parents found her in the morning, her toothless mouth was crammed full of dollar bills. So that's the end. Just a real quick overview of Make a Monster. You request monsters and I write short stories about them. I'm doing this to build awareness and following for Dreamer, which is a trilogy of books I'm trying to get traditionally published. You can learn more about it and Make a Monster at my website, saraamundson.com. Just go there and click on My Writing or Make a Monster and you'll learn everything you need to know. There's a link to the Tooth Fairy Monster story below this YouTube video if you want to read it. There'll also be a link to the Make a Monster request form if you want to ask for a monster yourself. And then I said I would tell you about the inspiration for this story real quick. So when I was a little kid, I was probably in first grade, so I don't know, 6, 7. I'd lost teeth before, and it was pretty spiffy getting money for it. And when I was that age, I lived in Southern California, and when it rained, they would cram us all into the auditorium. I guess they were afraid we would melt, and it was really super boring being in there. And so one day when that was happening, I decided, gee, I could really use some money. I didn't have any loose teeth at the time, but I was like, why should that stop me? So I just started working on a tooth. Thank God it was a baby tooth, and I would just start wriggling it and pulling on it, and pretty soon other kids were asking me like, hey, what are you doing? And I explained my genius money-making venture to them, and soon they were doing it too, probably 5 or 6 kids. And after a little while, we'd managed to rip all of our teeth out. And we did manage to do it, like, pretty much at the same time. So just, like, out of the blue in this auditorium, there's, like, 6 or 7 kids just suddenly gushing blood from their mouths. And so that was kind of the inspiration or the memory that I built this story out of. So obviously, since I have been encouraging people from a very young age to do horrific things to themselves, I was destined to be a horror writer. And anyway, I'll see y'all next week with another story to read to you.